In this video, we'll be EQing a few different parts of the song in mono. By EQing this way, it helps you better identify the problem frequencies that you need to cut or adjust inside your mixes. So if you're looking to improve your mixing process, I recommend giving out this technique a try on your next project. So EQing in mono is helpful for several different reasons. First, it ensures that your mix sounds good in mono, which is something that's always just helpful. And this means your mix is also nice and balanced. Most sound systems these days are in stereo, but by mixing in mono, it ensures that nothing is jumping out inside your mixdown and that you haven't missed any problem frequencies that you've just become accustomed to while you're working on your tracks, which is a problem I find happens to me all the time, especially if I'm producing and then mixing a song. It's very easy to get used to a really resonant frequency or a really harsh frequency, but by summing everything down to mono, it enables me to hear things in a fresh way, and these problem frequencies tend to jump right out, and then I can go in and adjust them. So by removing that stereo information that's rather distracting and can kind of mask some of these problem frequencies and resonances, just makes it easier to focus in on everything. So you can either EQ in mono at the start of your mixing process or incorporate this technique throughout your process, so either works depending on your mixing workflow and however you like to mix. So let's go ahead and jump into some practical examples inside of our mix. We have a few different problem frequencies with the piano and also some problems going on with the drums as well. So first we'll be starting off with the piano, and we'll be fixing these rather resonant and harsh sounding frequencies that are jumping out at us. Then after we work on that piano, we'll jump into our drums and be doing just some kind of practical equalization to show you how some really simple EQ changes done in mono makes it a bit easier to hear what we're kind of working with. So for this video, you want to either have really excellent studio speakers or a nice set of headphones, so you could listen to everything with a stereo set of speakers and to have a little bit more definition so you could hear these EQ changes that we're making. So let's go ahead and hop on over to the verse, which is the second verse. Let me just close out some of these other elements here to kind of clean up our session. And let's go ahead and listen to what everything sounds like together, and then I'll solo out this piano, and we'll kind of listen to some of these harsh resonant frequencies that we have going on inside of our piano. So this is actually a pretty good sounding piano recording. Piano is definitely one of those instruments that's very, very resonant, just characteristically, so it's quite hard to mix it properly. And this is a pretty good sounding piano recording, but there's definitely some problem areas and some problem frequencies in it, especially those kind of upper resonances. And listen to what happens whenever I sum the entire recording down to mono. The distraction of the stereo information is gone, and it'll be a bit easier to hear those exact two resonant peaks that we want to remove. So especially right here. So whenever I sum everything down to mono, those resonant peaks jump out to me in a bit more detail, and it's a bit easier to just hear those frequencies that I want to remove. So let's load up an equalizer, and let's go ahead and remove these. You can use any EQ here. I'll just use the FabFilter Pro Q2. But you could really use any equalizer here. Ableton 1 sounds great. Just drag and drop that onto our piano. And let's take a look here. Let's also go ahead and just loop this as well. The first frequency is probably about here or so. We'll just go ahead and find it. So it's probably about 24. You can kind of see these resonant boosts here as well. Let's go ahead and change this over to a 24 decibel filter. Make that Q a bit narrower. Let's go ahead and reduce that. This is what I'm removing. It's kind of those nasty resonances that are coming through on a few different notes. It's not happening on every note, but it's kind of happening on especially the second note here. There's also a lower resonance as well. You can kind of see this boost here. Let's go ahead and remove that one as well. Let's also do a rather narrow cue, maybe 24 decibels again. And we could take that gain down to something about there. You really hear that kind of body resonance of the piano. It's gone whenever we EQ that out. We could even maybe go just slightly lower as well, maybe 1,100 or so. We can maybe even dip that frequency down just a little bit more on both of those. And basically all we've done is grab those two different resonances. There's another resonant boost here as well that you probably could attenuate, but I'm just going to go ahead and leave that in there. It kind of helps the piano cut through the rest of the mix. I don't want to pull out all the harmonics in here because then our piano doesn't really have any melodic content to it. But these two are definitely providing a lot of resonance that's rather unpleasant in terms of the mix. So now let's go ahead and turn off our mono utility plugin. And this is what everything sounds like. Can I hear that whistliness is gone? So basically, we've just used the equalizer to remove that whistly quality of the overall piano. So when mixing your tracks, especially if you've been producing and writing them for a rather long time, it's easy to get used to bad sounding resonances and frequencies like this, and by swapping everything over to mono, it makes it easier to hear these problem areas that you may have missed, and it makes it easier to identify those exact frequencies because you're no longer distracted by the stereo information, which can make it hard to hear the exact frequency that you need to remove. So that way you don't take out any frequencies that are actually helpful for your sound that don't need to get removed. So it just gives you a little bit more of a surgical precision. So in terms of the mixdown, it sounds like this. So in context, the whole mix just kind of cuts some of that resonance and some of that bite out of the piano that we don't want. It just makes everything sound a bit clearer for the listener. Now let's hop over to our drums and just do some really practical equalization. We can maybe do kind of the solo breakdown area. And then we could do some basic EQing on these drums. By switching everything over to mono, just helps us hear some of those additional details, kind of like what we did with the volume leveling. So these changes will be a bit more subtle. It just makes it a bit easier to hear what's going on with our drums and the changes that we're making. Especially if you don't have the greatest studio speakers or acoustic treatment in your room, it just helps make everything a bit easier to hear. Let's take a listen to those drums. That snare could definitely use a little bit more punch, kind of in the low mid range. So we'll drop the EQ in. We can kind of cue up the snare. Maybe take out some of the bass frequencies because we don't really need it because it's a snare, it doesn't need sub bass. Let's also just kind of have a resonant boost here as well. So that way the snare has a bit more punch. Maybe 2 dB. It just brings a bit more body and life to the snare. And that resonant boost is a bit easier to hear exactly what we're doing once we kind of swapped everything over to mono. Let's next jump to our overheads, and we'll also be cutting out some of the bass in these because you don't need it. Let's just take that over to a low cut. Change it over to 24 decibels. Make sure that we're on mono. Okay, yep, everything looks great. Let's also just bring a little bit of air and life to these overheads. So that just kind of brightens up those overheads. and listen to what this sounds like back in context of our mix. It'll just kind of liven everything up a bit. So this isn't a super drastic change, it just gives a bit of life to the overheads. Then the last thing that I want to EQ on these drums is going to be this room mic channel. Make sure that's back to mono. And by itself, these just sound like this. These actually sound pretty good and are going to provide a lot of body for our drums, but there's definitely way too much sub bass. Cut that out. Put that EQ about 1. Now let's kind of adjust some of that low-end build-up that we're hearing. Probably about right here or so. Do 24 decibels and kind of liven that up. Just kind of clearing up some of the mud in our drums here. By itself, it just sounds like this. And this is what it would sound like if it was in stereo. So it's a bit harder to hear kind of this rumbliness. So by summing everything to mono, it just enables us to focus in on that kind of low-mid frequency. So it just kind of helps us find that frequency a bit quicker by summing everything to mono because we're not distracted. And then it helps us address that frequency in terms of the overall drum sound. So it just brings a bit more clarity to everything. So with everything together, those drums mixed sound like this. So by EQing everything in mono, it enabled us to get more clarity for our drums and to make sure that everything sounds nice and balanced, both in mono and in stereo, which just ensures that the overall mix has a nice balance to it. So EQing in mono can be helpful to find hard to hear frequencies that are creating problems in your mixes, and it also has the added benefit of making it easier to bring clarity to your mixes and to prevent unnecessary frequency buildup because it just focuses your mix down and problem areas will begin to jump out to you that are having low frequency or low mid buildup or high frequency resonances. So I recommend giving this technique a try on your next project, and you'll find that your mix downs have a lot more balance to them once you employ this technique.